The day my grandson quietly placed my missing Bronze Star on the kitchen table, I thought someone had finally solved a mystery that had haunted my family for more than 30 years. Then I opened the metal case. The Bronze Star belonged to me. The citation inside honored another soldier. Someone had spent decades making certain those two pieces were never separated. If you've ever discovered that an old family keepsake remembered more than the people who protected it, stay with me. For several long moments, I simply stared at the faded citation resting beside my medal. My hands knew the weight of that Bronze Star better than my own reflection. The Army had presented it to me near the end of my engineering service. I remembered the ceremony. I remembered the commanding officer. I remembered shaking hands. But I had never seen the name printed across that citation. Staff Sergeant William Mercer. Not Daniel Brooks, not even someone from my engineering company. Ethan stood quietly across the kitchen. He had always been patient, more like his grandmother than anyone else in the family. I found it in Grandma's cedar chest. "You've seen this before?" He slowly nodded. "Only once." "When?" "A few weeks before she passed away." That answer settled nothing. It only made the silence heavier. During 31 years as an Army engineering officer, I learned something every construction inspection eventually confirmed. When two permanent structures occupied the same foundation but didn't belong together, someone had intentionally joined them. I carefully examined the metal case. The velvet lining had been replaced. The hinge showed newer brass screws. Someone had repaired it years after I last held it. Not recently, long ago. Ethan watched me tracing the edges with my thumb. "I almost gave it to you last year." "What changed your mind?" "Grandma left me a letter." He immediately looked away. "I wasn't supposed to give you the medal until I believed you were ready." Ready. Not willing. Not interested. Ready. Technically honest, emotionally unfinished. I chose not to press him. My late wife never left instructions without purpose. That evening, I carried the medal into my workshop. Retirement had transformed the old garage into a place where I restored damaged military memorial plaques for local veterans. Small details mattered there, just as they always had in engineering. Under the bright workbench lamp, another inconsistency appeared. The citation's archive reference number began with VMA 1948. Every Bronze Star citation I had ever handled used a completely different military filing sequence. The paper itself looked authentic. The numbering did not. I quietly opened the filing cabinet containing copies of my own military records, every award, every assignment, every commendation. Nothing mentioned William Mercer. Nothing matched the archive number. Nothing explained why another veteran's honor rested inside my medal case. For the first time, I realized the missing Bronze Star had never been the real mystery. Its return had simply uncovered one that someone else had spent decades carefully protecting. The Bronze Star remained on my workbench long after Ethan drove home. Every few minutes, my eyes returned to the citation. Staff Sergeant William Mercer. The paper looked authentic. The medal looked authentic. Only their partnership felt impossible. The following morning, Ethan arrived carrying a small cardboard box wrapped in brown paper. "I almost forgot." "What is it?" "Grandma said you weren't supposed to see this until after the medal came home." He handed me the box with both hands. Inside rested an old Army archive envelope. Its flap had never been sealed again after someone first opened it decades earlier. Across the front, my late wife's handwriting appeared in neat blue ink. For Daniel, only after the medal returns, not after my death, not after Ethan graduated. After the medal returned, technically specific, emotionally unfinished. I carefully unfolded the contents. There wasn't a letter. There was only one museum admission receipt dated 28 years earlier. Across the bottom, someone had handwritten, Regional Military Heritage Museum. Temporary loan accepted. No explanation, no item description. Only one accession number, VMA 1948, the exact archive number printed on William Mercer's citation. During 31 years as an Army engineering officer, I learned another lesson. Every structural inspection eventually confirmed. When two unrelated identification numbers matched perfectly, they almost never met by accident. I quietly compared the receipt with the citation. Same archive number, same typewriter font, same faded blue stamp. One belonged to my wife, one belonged to another soldier. That afternoon I drove to the Regional Military Heritage Museum. The curator, Margaret Ellis, greeted me warmly. Mr. Brooks, I volunteer with the Memorial Restoration Group. I remember. She smiled. Your wife visited here many times. That surprised me. She never mentioned it. Margaret hesitated. She usually came alone. Another technically honest answer, emotionally incomplete. Instead of asking why, I showed her the museum receipt. She studied it for only a moment. I haven't seen one of these in years. Can you tell me what was loaned? I'm afraid I can't. Why not? Because the accession file was restricted by the donor. Restricted, not lost, not destroyed. Restricted. Margaret quietly disappeared into the archive room. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a visitor register instead of the restricted file. My wife's signature appeared 6 different times over 9 years. Every visit lasted less than 1 hour. Every visit ended with the same handwritten notation. Private collection review. Driving home, I realized my first conclusion had been wrong. My wife hadn't accidentally become connected to William Mercer's citation. She had returned to it repeatedly. That evening, I opened the cedar chest where Ethan had found the medal. Most of its contents looked exactly as I remembered. Old Christmas ornaments, family photographs, military reunion programs. Then I noticed something missing. The original Bronze Star presentation folder. The medal had returned. The folder had not. For the first time, I understood the missing medal wasn't the only object someone had carefully protected. Something inside that absent folder mattered just as much. For the next several days, I behaved exactly the way Ethan expected me to behave. I stopped asking about the Bronze Star. I returned the medal to its cedar box. I even thanked him for bringing it home, as though the wrong citation had become nothing more than an old filing mistake. Ethan relaxed, not because the mystery had disappeared, because he believed I had accepted the explanation my late wife wanted him to protect. 31 years as an Army engineering officer taught me another lesson every bridge inspection eventually proved. The moment people believed you had stopped measuring, they stopped hiding the cracks. That became my strategy. On Monday morning, I drove back to the Regional Military Heritage Museum. Margaret Ellis was already waiting beside the archive room. "I thought you'd come. I've been thinking about the restricted collection." "So have I." She unlocked a narrow steel cabinet and carefully removed a thick archival box. Across its faded label, someone had typed, "Private military donations, restricted access, not permanent exhibits, not public collections." Restricted. Inside rested dozens of accession folders arranged by archive number. When Margaret reached VMA 1948, she stopped. "I still can't show you the protected file." "I understand." Instead, she placed another document beside it, the museum's accession ledger. Every donated collection occupied a single line. Then I found the entry, VMA 1948, date received, 28 years earlier. Donor, not my wife, not William Mercer, only two initials, E. "B," I quietly asked. "Who approved anonymous donations back then?" Margaret looked toward the old museum photograph hanging on the wall. "Charles Whitmore, the former chairman of the Regional Veterans Association, a man I had known for years. Respected, careful, methodical." Another technically complete answer, emotionally unfinished. Instead of pressing further, I kept reading. Near the bottom of the ledger, another notation appeared, transferred under Memorial Promise Agreement. Agreement. Not donation, not correction. Agreement. Driving home, I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The mystery wasn't who mixed my medal with William Mercer's citation. The mystery was why several people formally agreed to keep them together. That afternoon, I searched through another cabinet in my workshop where my wife stored military correspondence she often helped organize for local veterans. Behind folded Memorial Day programs rested a worn leather portfolio. Inside lay dozens of thank you letters. Most came from veterans' families. Some came from military charities. Then one unsigned envelope quietly changed everything. Across the front, my wife had written only 4 words, "Return after truth survives." Nothing more, no name, no explanation, only that single sentence. That evening, Ethan stopped by after football practice. He immediately noticed the leather portfolio resting on my workbench. "You found Grandma's letters." "I did." He quietly sat beside me. "I wondered when." "I stopped asking questions." "I know." "And somehow—" I gently tapped the museum ledger. "That gave me more answers." Ethan smiled sadly. "Grandma always said promises become stronger when nobody feels forced to defend them." Before leaving, he quietly placed one sealed envelope beside the portfolio. It wasn't addressed to me. Across the front appeared one unfamiliar name, Mrs. Eleanor Mercer. The sealed envelope addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Mercer rested on my workbench long after Ethan drove home. I didn't open it, not yet. For more than 3 decades in Army engineering, I learned another habit that saved more projects than any blueprint ever could. When one unanswered question depended on another, opening the second file too early usually created the wrong conclusion. The following morning, I returned to the Regional Military Heritage Museum before it opened. Margaret Ellis was already waiting beside the archive office. "I thought you'd bring the envelope." I left it at home, she smiled. Good. I wasn't expecting that answer. Neither was your wife. Margaret unlocked another cabinet hidden behind the museum's restoration room. Unlike the public archive, these shelves contained administrative records, donation agreements, restricted access files, veterans memorial trusts, deferred recognition programs. One binder immediately caught my attention. Memorial promise agreements, not museum donations, not estate gifts, promises. Margaret carefully placed the binder on the reading table. Inside rested agreements spanning almost 25 years. Most involved families temporarily safeguarding military artifacts until missing records or surviving relatives could be located. Then I found the agreement carrying archive number VMA 1948. The signature page had been removed. Only the administrative summary remained. 2 military artifacts shall remain together until both families receive complete historical verification. Not one artifact. 2. The Bronze Star, William Mercer's citation. I quietly asked, "Who approved this agreement?" Margaret lowered her voice. "The museum never approved it. The Veterans Association did. And Charles Whitmore? He signed the authorization." Driving home, I realized my investigation had quietly changed direction. The mystery was no longer about an incorrect citation. It was about a formal agreement designed to keep 2 separate histories connected until someone decided they could finally be separated. That afternoon, I visited the Regional Veterans Association. Charles Whitmore welcomed me warmly. "Daniel, it's been too long." It has. He poured 2 cups of coffee before either of us mentioned the medal. "I heard Ethan found your Bronze Star." News traveled faster than records. "I've also been visiting the museum." His smile barely changed. "Margaret still keeps everything organized. Better than most people. Technically polite, emotionally cautious." I placed the museum receipt on his desk. "I've been trying to understand VMA 1948. Charles studied the receipt without touching it. Some old files are better left alone." "Because they're painful?" "Because reopening them doesn't always help the people still living." Another technically honest answer, emotionally incomplete. I didn't argue. Instead, I quietly thanked him for his time and stood to leave. As I reached the door, Charles spoke again. "If Eleanor trusted you enough to finally ask questions." He paused. "You're much closer than she ever hoped you'd become." He hadn't denied knowing my wife. He hadn't denied the agreement. He hadn't denied William Mercer. He had only confirmed that Eleanor expected this day to arrive. That evening, I finally opened the envelope addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Mercer. Inside rested a single handwritten letter. Not from Eleanor Mercer, from William Mercer's widow. The first sentence stopped me cold. "Thank you for agreeing to let Daniel carry part of my husband's honor until my family is ready to carry it themselves. For the first time since Ethan returned my missing Bronze Star, I understood something that changed every clue I had collected. The medal had never been misplaced. It had been entrusted. The widow's letter remained open on my workbench long after the sun disappeared behind the maple trees. I read the first sentence again. "Thank you for agreeing to let Daniel carry part of my husband's honor until my family is ready to carry it themselves. For years I believed the Bronze Star represented one man's service. Now I wondered whether it had quietly protected two families from a grief neither one had been ready to face. The following morning, I returned to the Regional Military Heritage Museum carrying the widow's letter inside a clear archival sleeve. Margaret Ellis recognized it immediately. "You finally opened it." I wasn't prepared for what it said. No one ever is. She led me into the restoration room instead of the public archive. A long oak table waited beneath bright conservation lamps. Already arranged across its surface rested several documents: the museum accession ledger, the memorial promise agreement summary, a probate inventory from the county archives, and one thin Veterans Association folder marked Mercer Family Correspondence. Margaret quietly opened the folder. Inside were letters exchanged over nearly 12 years. Most were routine: requests for military verification, museum inquiries, Veterans Day invitations. Then one document stopped me. It wasn't a letter. It was an estate inventory prepared after William Mercer's widow passed away. Under personal effects appeared a single handwritten notation: military citation entrusted under memorial promise agreement. Entrusted, not donated, not transferred, entrusted. During 31 years supervising Army engineering projects, I learned contracts always depended on precise language. The difference between ownership and stewardship could change an entire structure. I quietly asked who inherited the estate. Margaret hesitated. The Mercer grandchildren. Then why didn't they receive the citation? They refused the inheritance. Another technically honest answer, emotionally unfinished. She carefully unfolded another document, a family correspondence log. Nearly every certified letter sent to the Mercer descendants had been returned unopened, not once, not twice. 7 separate attempts. Across the final page, someone had written, "Continue preservation until descendants request historical verification." Driving home, I finally understood why my wife had protected the citation for so many years. No one had been willing to receive it. That afternoon, I visited the Regional Veterans Association again. Charles Whitmore welcomed me with the same careful smile. "You've learned more." "I have." I placed the probate inventory on his desk. This wasn't an administrative mistake. No. It was a promise. Yes. His answers came faster now, almost relieved. But promises eventually end. Charles slowly lowered his eyes. "Only when both families are ready." "And who decides that?" He remained silent. Silence became his answer. As I stood to leave, he quietly opened a locked desk drawer. For the first time, he removed a thin military file stamped Official Award Verification, William Mercer. He rested one hand on it but didn't slide it across the desk. "I can still keep this closed." "You can. It would protect everyone." I looked directly at him. "For another season. Not forever." Another technically true answer, emotionally complete. That evening, Ethan stopped by after helping prepare flags for the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony. He noticed the probate inventory beside the widow's letter. "You know now, don't you?" "I know enough." "No." He gently shook his head. "You know why Grandma trusted you." Before leaving, he quietly handed me one final envelope. This one bore an official seal from the Department of the Army. It had never been opened. Across the front, my wife's handwriting appeared one last time. Only after William's family chooses the truth. For the first time since my grandson returned the Bronze Star, I realized the greatest risk was no longer losing another veteran's honor. It was deciding whether two families were finally ready to share it. The unopened Department of the Army envelope remained in the center drawer of my workbench for 3 days. I looked at it every morning. I refused to break the seal. My late wife had written only one instruction: only after William's family chooses the truth. For 31 years, the Army trusted me to follow engineering specifications even when no one stood beside me to watch. A promise carried the same weight, especially one left by Eleanor. On Thursday morning, Margaret Ellis called before breakfast. "They've contacted the museum." I set my coffee down. "Who has?" "William Mercer's grandchildren." The room fell silent. They requested historical verification. Exactly the words written inside the probate records. Not inheritance, not compensation. Historical verification. The waiting period had ended. Within an hour, I arrived at the museum. Margaret already had 4 archival boxes arranged across the restoration table. Unlike every document I had seen before, these carried official government seals, Veterans Association minutes, museum accession records, county probate correspondence, Department of the Army verification file. Track A had quietly reached its final destination. Margaret gently pointed toward the sealed Army envelope I had brought with me. "You may open it now." I looked at Eleanor's handwriting one last time, then carefully broke the seal. Inside rested a military verification certificate. Beneath it lay 2 original award citations. One carried my name. The second honored Staff Sergeant William Mercer. Neither citation had ever been incorrect. Neither medal had ever been exchanged. Instead, an attached memorandum explained the agreement. Following William Mercer's death, his widow feared her estranged children would destroy every reminder of his military service. Unable to trust her own family, she turned to the only veteran her husband had repeatedly described with unwavering respect: me. Not because we had served together, because years later I had quietly restored a neglected memorial honoring William's engineering battalion without ever knowing his name. Eleanor met William's widow during that dedication. The friendship that followed changed both families forever. The Bronze Star had never represented borrowed honor. It represented borrowed trust. That afternoon we drove together to the Regional Veterans Association. Charles Whitmore was waiting in the conference room. He saw the opened Army envelope immediately. "So they finally asked?" "They did." He slowly nodded. "I hoped they would." For the first time since this investigation began, he unlocked the association archive cabinet without hesitation. Inside rested the original Memorial Promise Agreement, bearing every required signature. William's widow, Eleanor Brooks, Charles Whitmore, the museum curator, 2 witnesses, no deception, only stewardship. Charles quietly pushed the document toward me. "I could have destroyed this years ago." "But you didn't." "No. I kept waiting for the right family to become ready." Another technically true answer, this time emotionally complete. Margaret carefully arranged every document across the conference table. The Bronze Star, both citations, the museum accession ledger, the probate inventory, the association minutes, the original agreement. Track A had fully become Track B. Every clue now carried official documentary authority. Charles looked toward the Veterans Day ceremony schedule hanging beside the doorway. I still have one chance. To do what? Leave history unfinished. He understood exactly what tomorrow required. Either the complete story would finally be shared, or William Mercer would remain known only through incomplete records for another generation. As I gathered the documents back into their archival sleeves, one question refused to leave my mind. If honoring another soldier had quietly shaped my own family's legacy for nearly 30 years, what would happen when William's grandchildren finally learned whose hands had been carrying their grandfather's honor all along? The Veterans Day memorial ceremony began beneath a clear autumn sky. Hundreds of veterans gathered across the courthouse lawn. Families carried folded flags. School children placed white carnations beside polished granite memorials. The brass band quietly tuned their instruments while volunteers arranged rows of empty chairs. Most people believed they had come to honor another Veterans Day. Only a handful of us understood that one forgotten promise was finally about to be completed. Ethan stood beside me holding the cedar metal box. He never opened it. He didn't need to. We both knew what rested inside. My Bronze Star. William Mercer's Citation. The original Army verification. Margaret Ellis arrived carrying 4 archival binders: the Museum Accession Records, the Veterans Association Minutes, the County Probate Correspondence, the Memorial Promise Agreement. No dramatic speeches, no accusations, only decades of carefully preserved documentation. Charles Whitmore greeted me near the memorial platform. "I'm glad you came, Daniel." "So am I." He looked toward the audience. "I've wondered about this day for a long time." "I think Eleanor did too." He quietly nodded. The ceremony opened with the national anthem. A color guard posted the colors. Names of local veterans lost in service were read aloud. Then Charles stepped to the podium. "Our final dedication today concerns a historical correction." The audience remained silent. Most expected another museum announcement. Instead, Charles slowly removed a sealed archival folder from the podium. "I believe protecting this agreement was the right decision." He paused. "I eventually realized protecting it forever would become the wrong one." Margaret quietly joined him without a single accusation. She placed the original Memorial Promise Agreement onto the presentation table. Then the Museum Accession Records. Then the Veterans Association Minutes. Finally, Ethan opened the cedar metal box. He carefully removed my Bronze Star. Then William Mercer's citation. Then the Department of the Army verification. Track B had fully emerged, not because anyone confessed, because every document quietly confirmed the next. Margaret opened the association minutes. Each administrative decision, each museum transfer, each probate reference, every signature matched. Every archive number agreed. Every historical record supported the one beside it. Charles removed his glasses. Many years ago, William Mercer's widow feared her family would destroy every reminder of his military service. He looked toward the front row where 3 unfamiliar adults quietly listened. She asked another military family to protect part of his history until her grandchildren someday asked for the truth. Then he turned toward me. Daniel Brooks never knew he had accepted that responsibility. I finally understood something my wife had carried without ever asking for recognition. She had never protected a secret. She had protected another family's opportunity to choose reconciliation for themselves. Margaret handed the Army verification to William Mercer's eldest granddaughter. She accepted it with trembling hands. No applause followed, only silence, the kind of silence earned by truth instead of surprise. Then one unexpected complication quietly arrived. A member of the Veterans Association Board stood. "Charles, if this agreement existed all these years," he hesitated, "why wasn't the board informed?" Charles answered without looking away, "Because I believed institutional certainty mattered more than unfinished family grief." Another technically honest answer. This time, it carried consequences. The board chairman quietly reviewed the signed agreements, the museum records, the probate files, the Army verification. Nothing depended on memory. Everything depended on evidence. He slowly closed the final binder. The association failed to complete the promise it accepted. No anger, no humiliation, only accountability. Charles nodded. "You're right." He stepped away from the podium and removed the association chairman's ceremonial medallion. "I should have finished this years ago." Then he placed it on the table beside the memorial promise agreement. The concealment had finally collapsed. Not because someone won, because every promise had finally reached the day it was always meant to meet. 1 year later, the Bronze Star rested in a different display case, not because it had gained greater value, because it finally carried its complete history. The cedar box still sat inside my workshop. Only now it held 2 copies of the Army verification. One belonged to my family. The other had been preserved for the Mercer family archives. The original Memorial Promise Agreement had become part of the Regional Military Heritage Museum's permanent collection. Visitors no longer saw only medals and uniforms. They saw the story of 2 families who quietly protected one another's honor until truth finally arrived at the right time. Margaret Ellis carefully archived every document together: the museum accession records, the Veterans Association minutes, the county probate correspondence, the Department of the Army verification, the original Memorial Promise Agreement. Nothing remained hidden. Nothing was separated again. Future curators would never mistake stewardship for ownership. Charles Whitmore remained with the Veterans Association, but no longer as chairman. Instead, he volunteered as the organization's historical records advisor. At every orientation for new volunteers, he shared the same lesson. Protecting history never means postponing truth forever. No public humiliation followed. Only honest accountability. The association unanimously adopted a permanent archival policy. No restricted memorial agreement could remain incomplete once the families involved requested historical verification. Margaret smiled after the final vote. Eleanor always believed promises deserved endings. She was right. Several weeks later, Ethan and I visited William Mercer's grandchildren at the museum. For the first time, the Bronze Star and William's original citation rested side by side inside a shared memorial display. Not because either artifact belonged to both families, because the story did. I quietly asked William's eldest granddaughter, "Do you understand why your grandmother trusted mine?" She smiled through quiet tears. I think she knew your family would protect our grandfather's honor until we were finally ready to protect it ourselves. I nodded slowly. For years I believed I had been carrying my medal. She gently looked toward the display. You were carrying our family's courage, too. Ethan quietly placed the cedar box beneath the museum display, no longer hiding a mystery, simply honoring a completed promise. If this story reminded you that the greatest acts of honor are often the ones quietly protected until others are ready to receive them, thank you for spending this journey with us. May every promise entrusted to your family be carried with integrity, completed with courage, and remembered with gratitude for generations to come.